Two police officers with deeply ingrained racial prejudice cruelly tied a black man with a rope and dragged him behind their patrol car, all because of his appearance in the old vehicle they scorned. But, less than 24 hours later, they were utterly shocked to discover that he was the one person who could overthrow the very system they served. Before delving into this shocking story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss powerful and unforgettable narratives. In the flickering light of the patrol car's siren, a man was being dragged along the highway. The mocking laughter of those in power echoed through the night, but they didn't realize their actions would change their lives forever. On a desolate highway, the faint moonlight illuminated the cracks in the aged asphalt. The silence was so profound that only the chirping of insects and the whistling wind through the trees could be heard. Inside the patrol car, Lieutenant David, a middle-aged man with a stern face, sat behind the wheel. Beside him, Rookie Officer Chris reclined in his seat, tapping his fingers impatiently against the window. The atmosphere in the car was heavy and tense. Chris broke the silence with a sarcastic remark. "Notice something, David? The ones driving down this road always look the same. Old cars, untrustworthy appearance. Usually, we guess right." David didn't respond, merely smirking, a look of both agreement and disdain. In the distance, the dim headlights of a car emerged, moving slowly as though groping its way through the darkness. The car, an old sedan, appeared weary with every inch it advanced. David turned on the patrol car's sirens, the red and blue lights flashing in the night. Chris sneered and said, "Looks like tonight's gonna be interesting." They sped up and forced the sedan to pull over onto the roadside. The car cautiously came to a stop. When the two officers stepped out of their patrol car, the headlights illuminated the man sitting inside the sedan. Elijah Carter, a black businessman dressed impeccably in a crisp shirt and a neat tie, looked at them through the window. His face was calm, devoid of fear, though his eyes showed a flicker of wariness. Chris knocked on the car window with his flashlight, speaking with a tone full of attitude. "Roll down the window. License and registration?" Elijah quietly complied, retrieving the documents from the glove compartment and handing them to Chris without a word. As Chris looked through the papers, he squinted and said mockingly, "Pretty flashy, huh? But this car doesn't seem to match your outfit." David, still silent, walked over to the other side of the car and gestured for Elijah to step out. Elijah frowned slightly but kept his voice composed. "Officer, I don't believe I violated any traffic laws." "Step out of the car now," David ordered, his voice cold and leaving no room for argument. Elijah reluctantly got out of the car. Chris stepped right in front of him, face to face. He tilted his chin up, looking Elijah over from head to toe, then smirked. "Stand straight. Now, put your hands behind your head." Elijah complied, maintaining his composure. But things didn't stop there. Chris began searching his car, tossing items onto the ground carelessly. Elijah spoke up softly. "You have no right to do this. I have nothing illegal." Chris turned around, holding a length of rope from Elijah's trunk, raising it as if it were incriminating evidence. He sneered. "Oh, what's this for? Big plans tonight?" "It's just a rope," Elijah replied, his tone steady. But Chris wasn't satisfied with the answer. He approached Elijah, tied the rope around his shoulders, and dragged him to the middle of the road, laughing loudly. "Let's teach you a lesson about driving slow on our roads." David remained still, saying nothing, his cold gaze watching the scene unfold. He neither intervened nor stopped Chris. As Chris tied the other end of the rope to the back of the patrol car, he looked back at Elijah with a sinister grin. "Ready? Let's go for a little ride." Chris dragged Elijah a short distance along the road. David watched through the rearview mirror, silent but showing clear approval of the violence. Elijah did not resist, remaining quiet, his eyes fixed on the horizon. But within, a plan had already begun to take shape. That night, as David and Chris's patrol car quietly left the scene, leaving Elijah standing alone on the cold highway, the two officers didn't for a moment consider that their actions might have severe consequences. David drove, his gaze fixed straight ahead. With over 2 decades in the force, he embodied the image of a hardened veteran, jaded, cold, and harboring resentment toward a system he believed had failed. Deep down, David didn't see his actions as wrong. He reasoned that soft principles and oversight from leadership were weakening the ability to maintain order. To him, sometimes violence was necessary to teach a lesson to those he deemed undeserving of respect. Beside him, Chris was brimming with energy, but not the positive kind. As a rookie, Chris was eager to prove himself, especially to David, whom he admired and sought approval from. Malicious jokes and abuse of power were his way of seeking affirmation from his superior. In the moment of dragging Elijah behind the patrol car, Chris felt a rush of exhilaration. He burst out laughing. "See that, David? Guys like him just need a little lesson to learn their place." David didn't reply, but a subtle nod was enough to let Chris know he had done the right thing in the eyes of the man he idolized. Meanwhile, Elijah's sedan sat quietly on the roadside, seemingly just an old, harmless vehicle. But David and Chris had no idea that the very car held a significant threat to them. A hidden camera, carefully installed behind the rearview mirror, had recorded the entire incident. Elijah was not only intelligent, but also cautious. He understood that sometimes calmness and thorough preparation could be the most powerful weapons. Elijah had faced discrimination and violence many times before. This time, he was determined not to be a silent victim. As Chris jeered and pulled the rope, as David stood there coldly observing, every action was meticulously recorded. Every laugh, every insult. When Elijah got home, he didn't rush to contact the authorities. Sitting in his compact room, the light from his computer screen reflected off his face. Elijah opened the footage captured by the hidden camera, rewinding and replaying each moment. From Chris's mocking tone to David's complicit silence. In his eyes, the usual calmness was slowly replaced by fiery determination. Elijah knew he couldn't take on the entire system alone. But he wasn't alone. He began reaching out to people in the community, friends, allies, and activists for justice. A small, yet resolute group quickly formed. Elijah laid out the incident, presented the evidence, and convinced them that this was an opportunity not just to demand justice for him, but to bring about broader change. "We can't let them keep doing this," Elijah said during a small meeting with his supporters. "They didn't just humiliate me. They humiliated this entire community, and I won't let this pass like all the times before." Elijah's group quickly began strategizing. They didn't just want to expose the incident, but planned to use it as leverage to demand comprehensive reform in the police force. Meanwhile, Elijah kept the evidence to himself, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal his hand. While Elijah quietly prepared, David and Chris went about their daily lives, completely unaware of the storm brewing. They believed their actions were just one among countless street lessons they had delivered. But this time, they didn't realize their opponent wasn't a submissive victim, but a man who knew exactly how to fight for justice. The next morning, the atmosphere at the small-town police station was as routine as ever. Phones rang, scattered conversations filled the air, and the strong scent of coffee lingered in the space. David and Chris walked into the station with smug expressions. To them, last night was just another normal night on patrol. Chris poured himself a cup of coffee, laughing as he chatted with a colleague. Last night was fun. People like him need a reminder about who's really in charge. David said nothing, standing in a corner, his eyes staring into the distance as if contemplating something. Though he didn't speak, a faint unease simmered deep inside him. The routine was quickly interrupted. The station's doors opened and a man walked in. Everyone froze. Elijah Carter, dressed in a sharp suit, stepped through the threshold. He was no longer the man humiliated the night before, but a commanding and confident figure. David lifted his head, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Elijah. Chris, mid-laugh, immediately went stiff, his coffee cup trembling in his hand. The other officers murmured among themselves as Elijah strode directly to Captain Harris's office without hesitation. "What's he doing here?" Chris whispered nervously. David didn't reply, but his hand clenched involuntarily. Inside Captain Harris's office, a tense conversation unfolded. Harris, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, sat behind his desk. Across from him, Elijah stood tall, his gaze calm yet piercing. "I'm not here to play the victim," Elijah began, his voice deep and resolute. "I'm here to expose a larger problem. This is something you need to see." He placed a small USB drive on the desk. Harris frowned, plugging it into his computer. On the screen, the footage from Elijah's hidden camera played, showing every detail of the previous night's events. Every word and every action by David and Chris was laid bare. Harris's expression shifted from surprise to anger as the video concluded. "David and Chris went too far," Elijah continued, his tone firm but controlled. "But this isn't just about them. It's about the entire system you oversee." Harris, striving to maintain composure, responded, "What do you want, Carter?" Elijah leaned forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "I want justice, but not just for me. I want real change. If not, this video will go public. The media, the community, everyone will know what happened." "Are you threatening me?" Harris asked, his voice heavy. "It's not a threat," Elijah replied. "It's an opportunity. You have a chance to make things right, not just for me, but for a community that's been neglected and abused for years." Outside the office, David and Chris waited anxiously. When Harris opened the door, his face grave, they both immediately straightened up. Harris pointed at them and ordered, "Get in here, now." Inside the small office, as David and Chris faced Elijah, they knew the tables had turned. Elijah was no longer someone they could intimidate or humiliate. He stood before them as a symbol of resilience and power. For the first time, they felt the weight of true fear. The atmosphere in Captain Harris's office grew oppressive. David and Chris stood facing Elijah, their eyes restless. Chris, young and easily agitated, seemed unable to maintain his composure. In contrast, David stood silently, but the cold sharpness in his gaze suggested he was considering something far deeper. When Harris played the video again, Chris's sneering laughter echoed from the screen like a slap in the silent room. Elijah stood nearby, observing every expression on the faces of those present. He didn't need to say anything. The evidence spoke for itself. Chris was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling. "Captain, this isn't how it looks. It's just a misunderstanding. The man, provoked us on purpose." David glanced at Chris, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. "A misunderstanding?" David said, his voice low and sardonic. "Are you saying this video was fabricated? Because if not, I fail to see how this qualifies as a misunderstanding." Chris turned to David, his eyes flaring with anger. "You were there too. You didn't stop me. You agreed with me." David remained calm, but his eyes glinted with danger. "You're right. I didn't stop you. But who held the rope? Who laughed like a fool while humiliating someone?" The tension escalated as a rift began to form. To save himself, Chris placed the blame squarely on David, accusing him of being the leader of the incident, while portraying himself as merely following implicit orders. David, however, deflected all responsibility, blaming Chris's immaturity and impulsiveness. Under pressure from Captain Harris, the conflict between David and Chris intensified. Harris, furious, demanded they stop blaming each other and focus on solving the problem. "This isn't just about you two," Harris bellowed. "You've dragged this entire station into a nightmare. If this gets out, we'll all lose our jobs. And you two, well, you won't just lose your careers, you could end up in prison." Harris's warning didn't calm the situation. Instead, it deepened the mutual suspicion and betrayal between David and Chris. Outside the office, other officers began murmuring about what was going on. Rumors spread quickly through the station, and the reputations of David and Chris began to crumble. They were no longer seen as reliable colleagues, but as troublemakers who had put the entire department in jeopardy. While Chris panicked, David started acting strategically. He understood that Elijah wasn't just a victim. He was a dangerous adversary who knew how to wield power and rally community support. If David didn't act, his career would be utterly destroyed. David secretly contacted Reeves, another veteran officer in the department. Reeves was known for his hardline views and staunch opposition to any form of reform. He believed people like Elijah were a threat to the traditions of the police force. In a quiet, dimly lit bar, David met with Reeves. The two sat in a shadowy corner, whispering. David outlined the situation, emphasizing that Elijah wasn't just a threat to him, but to the entire department's reputation. "He doesn't just want us fired," David said, his voice low and menacing. "He wants to dismantle the entire system." Reeves nodded, his eyes flashing with agreement. "We can't let that happen. I've got some people who can help," Reeves said. They discussed a plan to discredit Elijah. Reeves suggested spreading rumors that Elijah had staged the incident to attack the police department. Additionally, he promised to leverage his connections within the local government to create roadblocks and delay any investigations. Meanwhile, Elijah remained unaware of the scheme being plotted against him. He continued working on his reform plan, steadily gathering more support from the community and external organizations. However, the shadow of David and Reeves's conspiracy began to loom, setting the stage for an intense and brutal confrontation to come. News of the video Elijah possessed and the abuses of power by David and Chris quickly spread throughout the town. At first, it was just whispers in local coffee shops and markets, but soon the story became the main topic of every conversation. Despite Elijah's efforts to keep everything under control, he couldn't prevent public opinion from becoming divided. Some members of the community, particularly those who had experienced injustice at the hands of the police, immediately sided with Elijah. They saw him as a symbol of hope and change. They organized discussions and put up banners in front of the police station demanding justice and reform. "We can't let this continue," a resident declared during a small meeting at a church. "Elijah has shown great courage by standing up. Now it's our turn to fight alongside him." However, not everyone agreed. A group of people, mostly older residents or those with close ties to the police, expressed concerns. They believed reforms would cause instability, weakening the police force against crime. "I'm not saying what they did was right. a middle-aged man commented at a cafe. "But we can't dismantle the entire system over a few mistakes. Who will protect us if the police lose their authority?" These opposing views quickly deepened the divide in the community. The debates extended beyond meetings, erupting on social media and in daily encounters. Not all discussions remained peaceful. During a community meeting at the local church, tensions between those supporting and opposing reform escalated into heated arguments. "Who are you people to demand these reforms?" shouted Mr. Mark, a cattle rancher, in the middle of the meeting. "Do you know what will happen if the police lose their authority? Criminals will take advantage, and we'll all be unsafe." In another corner of the room, Mrs. Linda, who had lost her son to police violence, stood up to respond. Her voice was choked with emotion but filled with resolve. "What safety, Mr. Mark? Did my family feel safe when the police abused their power and took my son's life? Reform isn't about weakening the police. It's about protecting all of us." The room fell into a heavy, tense silence. Standing on the stage, Elijah tried to calm the situation. "We're not here to fight each other. Reform isn't about tearing down. It's about rebuilding so everyone feels safe, without discrimination. Please, let's give each other the chance to listen and understand." Elijah's words managed to somewhat ease the tension, but the divide continued to smolder within the community. With every step toward reform, voices of fear and resistance grew louder, presenting new challenges to the path forward. Recognizing the situation, Elijah decided to organize a large town hall meeting to present the facts. He hoped that by publicly sharing the evidence and engaging in direct dialogue, he could rally broader support. The meeting took place in a tense atmosphere. The hall was packed with both Elijah's supporters and those opposing him. Standing on the stage, Elijah faced a large screen where the video replayed. Each frame, every insult from Chris, and David's silent complicity made the air in the room grow heavier. When the video ended, a scattering of applause broke out from supporters, but it was met with murmurs of discontent from the opposition. "We can't let this go unaddressed," Elijah said, his voice strong and resolute. "But I'm not here to simply point fingers. I want us to work together to improve things, to ensure this police force truly serves and protects everyone, without prejudice." Almost immediately, an older man stood up, his voice filled with anger. "You want reform, but reform will strip our police of their strength. We need strong law enforcement, not moral lectures." Applause erupted from the opposition. Tensions mounted further when a young woman, representing Elijah's supporters, stood up to respond. "What about those who've suffered injustices? We are a part of this community too, and we deserve fair treatment." The meeting quickly devolved into a heated debate. Elijah tried to steer the discussion, but the divide was undeniable. Some left the hall visibly angry, while others stayed, hoping to find answers in his words. Elijah left the hall with a heavy heart. He knew this was only the beginning of a long, arduous journey. Trust couldn't be built overnight, and real change would require more than stirring speeches. Still, he refused to let himself be discouraged. Far away, in a dark corner of the town, David and Reeves sat in a small bar. Reeves sipped his drink, raising an eyebrow as footage from the meeting played on the TV above the bar counter. "He's good," Reeves remarked with a hint of disdain, "but he doesn't know who he's up against." David remained silent, his eyes fixed on the screen. In his mind, a new plan began to take shape. Elijah might have won over some support, but David knew how to turn the tide. With Reeves's help, he was ready to do whatever it took to protect himself and dismantle everything Elijah was building. In the dim light of the bar, David and Reeves sat across from each other, their glasses of liquor gradually emptying. Reeves slowly set his glass down, his piercing eyes locked onto David. "We can't let him win," Reeves said, his voice low but resolute. "Elijah Carter isn't the hero he pretends to be. He's an opportunist, and I know how to make everyone see that." David, maintaining his usual composure, nodded. He understood the danger Elijah posed, but he also knew that defeating him would require careful, calculated action. "So, Reeves," David said, his voice cold and deliberate, "where do we start?" Reeves had once been an idealistic young officer, but his career had been severely derailed during an internal corruption investigation he tried to expose. The system turned its back on him, robbing him of promotions and sidelining him for years. Those years of bitterness transformed Reeves from someone seeking to change the system into someone determined to preserve power at all costs to avoid being threatened again. Reeves often used his story of betrayal to persuade other officers to side with him, emphasizing that reform would strip them of their power, just as it had cost him everything. "I believed in change," Reeves said during a closed-door meeting with senior officers. "And you all know what happened to me. Elijah Carter isn't a hero. He's here to destroy everything we've built." Reeves's first step was spreading rumors that Elijah was exploiting the situation to further his political ambitions. Younger officers in the force were often hesitant when Reeves approached them. They saw him as a bitter man who opposed any form of change. But Reeves knew how to sow doubt. "Look around," he told a newly recruited officer. "Do you think this system will still have a place for people like you if we don't fight back? Elijah and people like him only want power, and once they have it, you'll be nothing but a pawn." Anonymous articles began appearing on small news sites, with headlines laced with skepticism. "Elijah Carter, champion of justice or opportunist?" And "What is Elijah's real agenda?" David played a supporting role from within. He provided Reeves with falsified information about Elijah, including details about his finances and past relationships that could be twisted to tarnish his reputation. These rumors quickly spread, shaking the confidence of some community members who had initially supported Elijah. Reeves didn't stop there. He went further by approaching someone within Elijah's support network. Mark, an old friend who had worked with Elijah on social initiatives, was targeted by Reeves with an offer he found hard to refuse: a significant sum of money in exchange for revealing the group's detailed plans. At first, Mark refused, but financial pressure, coupled with subtle threats, began to wear him down. He quietly leaked information to Reeves about private meetings and Elijah's strategies for publicly unveiling evidence. Elijah soon noticed irregularities when several critical plans were compromised. During a team meeting, he addressed the group directly, his voice calm but firm. "We have a traitor. Someone is using our information to undermine us." The room fell into heavy silence. Mark lowered his head, avoiding Elijah's gaze. His silence spoke volumes. "Mark," Elijah said, his tone low but commanding, "if you have something to say, now is the time." Unable to hide any longer, Mark confessed everything, to the shock of everyone present. I didn't know Reeves would go this far. I thought I was just protecting myself." Elijah looked at Mark with disappointment, but no anger. "You've hurt not just me but the community we're trying to protect. But if you truly want to make things right, help me turn this around." Filled with regret, Mark agreed to cooperate. He began feeding false information back to Reeves, leading Reeves to fall into his traps and subsequent plans. Meanwhile, Elijah felt the mounting pressure. His inbox was flooded with anonymous emails containing threats. Some messages used overtly racist language, while others targeted his family, forcing him to send his wife and children to a safe location. Elijah's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from unknown numbers. Some warned him to stop his efforts before things get worse. These words weren't just threats, but mental daggers meant to wear him down. One morning, when Elijah arrived at his temporary office, he found the door forced open. Inside, documents were scattered, and his computer screen was smashed. Though there was no direct evidence, he knew this was a clear message from those trying to stop him. But Elijah wasn't someone who bowed easily. He quickly bolstered security, collaborating with trusted allies to ensure the reform efforts continued. He hired a personal security team and moved crucial documents to a secure cloud to prevent theft. Simultaneously, Elijah decided to host more community meetings, this time not only to rally support, but also to expose the schemes against him. At a meeting in a local church, he spoke openly to the attendees. "Threats and rumors won't deter me. They only prove that we're getting closer to the truth. And the truth, no matter how painful, is essential for change." Elijah's words deeply resonated with many, but the community's division couldn't be mended entirely. Reeves and David, watching from a dark corner somewhere, continued to observe and strategize. They knew Elijah was a formidable opponent, but they remained confident they could break his resolve with their next moves. The pressure on Elijah grew heavier with each passing day, his steps feeling slower as the threats, rumors, and opposition mounted. Despite having the support of a segment of the community, he couldn't deny that the storm created by David and Reeves was shaking the trust of many. One evening, Elijah sat in his dimly lit office, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating stacks of documents and the flicker of his computer screen. In a rare moment of quiet, he picked up his phone and called an old friend, Marcus, a social activist he had worked with on a similar case years ago. "Marcus," Elijah said, his voice heavy, "I'm not sure I can go through this again." Marcus was silent on the other end for a moment before responding. "Elijah, I remember the first time we met. You told me, change is never easy, but if we don't fight for it, who will? You told me that failure isn't a reason to quit, but a motivation to do better." Elijah chuckled faintly, but his eyes glistened with emotion. He remembered the past defeats, the times when the system had crushed him, and those who stood with him. But this time he was determined not to let history repeat itself. "Marcus," Elijah continued, "this time is different. They're not just attacking me, they're threatening my family. I've sent them away to be safe, but the fear of losing them, it's overwhelming." Marcus took a deep breath, his voice firm as he replied, "That's exactly why you need to keep going. What you're doing isn't just for yourself. It's for a generation, Elijah. Don't let them break your resolve." Marcus's words reignited a spark in Elijah. He knew that, despite the mounting pressure, he couldn't allow it to obscure his larger purpose. As Elijah worked to maintain his resolve, fractures began to appear within the police department. Captain Harris, who had initially supported Elijah, was now wavering under pressure from senior officers and local government officials. At a closed-door meeting with a small group of officers, Harris noticed the growing resistance. Reeves, leading the opposition, spoke up. "Captain, we can't let an outsider like Elijah Carter destroy the reputation of this force. The reforms he's proposing will strip us of our authority. He doesn't understand the realities of our work." Harris, though trying to stand his ground, couldn't deny the influence of Reeves's words. Other officers, many with long-standing ties to Reeves, nodded in agreement. "We have to think this through," another officer said. "If this continues, it's not just us but the entire local government that will be dragged into this mess." These statements only added to Harris's pressure. He realized that while he wanted to support Elijah, he also faced the risk of losing the backing of his force. Harris began to avoid Elijah, declining frequent meetings and delaying reform discussions. Elijah quickly noticed the change. One morning, when he went to Harris's office, he was stopped by an officer who gave him a curt message. "The captain isn't available right now. He'll contact you later." Elijah turned and walked away, his heart heavy. He understood that Harris, though silent, was being pulled toward the opposition. This wasn't just a personal disappointment, but a significant threat to the entire reform effort. Returning to his office, Elijah found his team waiting for him. One of them spoke up. "Elijah, we need a breakthrough. If Captain Harris is no longer on our side, we need to find another way to push for reform." Elijah nodded, his eyes lighting up with renewed determination. "If they want to back me into a corner," he said, "then I'll show them I'm not just a man with a few videos. I'm part of a community, and this community will not be silenced." With those words, Elijah began crafting his next move, a plan that would challenge Reeves, David, and everyone else working to stop him. Elijah knew that only a bold move could shift the tide. The silence from Captain Harris and the mounting pressure from Reeves and David made him realize that everything had to be brought into the light. He decided to organize a large town hall meeting at the community center, inviting the public, the media, and the leadership of the police department. The meeting became the focal point of the town. Residents crowded into the hall, where a large screen was positioned at the center of the stage. Local media were present, and cameras were trained on the event. Elijah stepped onto the stage, exuding confidence and determination. His gaze swept across the crowd, meeting faces filled with both hope and skepticism. Captain Harris sat in the front row, his expression heavy. Reeves and David sat nearby, both silent but with calculating glints in their eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elijah began, his voice clear and resonant, filling the hall. "I'm not here to talk about a personal incident. I'm here to address a larger issue, the abuse of power and the urgent need for change." He gestured toward the screen, and the footage from his hidden camera began to play. The images were vivid and undeniable, exposing every action and word of David and Chris. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some people were stunned into silence, others let out audible gasps, and a few shook their heads in disgust. When the video ended, Elijah continued, "This isn't about an individual mistake. It's the result of a system that allows actions like this to go unchecked and unpunished." Chris couldn't handle the pressure. He stood abruptly, pointing at Elijah and shouting, "This is a fraud. You're trying to smear us for your gain." Elijah remained calm, his gaze piercing through Chris. "If you want to deny it," Elijah said sharply, "then explain what we just watched." Chris stammered, searching for a response, but found none. Every eye in the hall turned toward him, including David's, whose expression remained icy. Unexpectedly, David spoke, his voice low and weighted. "Stop, Chris. The truth is clear." The entire hall froze in shock. David, who had always appeared unyielding, was now admitting to his actions. "I was wrong," he continued, "and I take responsibility for what I've done." David's words left Chris completely isolated. Chris turned to David, his face red with anger and humiliation. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "Are you throwing me under the bus?" David didn't reply. He lowered his head, as though accepting the reality that his career and life, as he knew it, had reached their conclusion. Just when everyone thought the matter was resolved, Reeves rose from the back of the room. As he slowly stepped toward the center of the hall, all eyes turned to him. His gaze was a mix of anger and unease, his hands gripping the microphone tightly. His voice, firm but with a slight tremor, echoed through the hall. "Elijah Carter is not the savior you think he is," Reeves began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "He's an opportunist. He doesn't care about justice. What he wants is power. Power to control all of us." A murmur rippled through the audience. Undeterred, Reeves pressed on, his tone growing sharper. "You think reform is the answer? Do you know where it leads? Chaos. The weakening of the system we've built over decades." Reeves's eyes locked onto Elijah, his stare full of defiance. But behind the defiance, Elijah caught a fleeting glimpse of fear, the fear of losing the power Reeves had clung to his entire life. Remaining calm, Elijah stepped forward. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I'm not standing here to seek power. I'm standing here to reclaim the justice that you and others like you have stolen from this community." Reeves forced a faint, awkward smile, but no one in the hall sensed confidence behind it. He tried to counter, "Don't pretend to be a saint, Elijah. Be honest. What do you want from us? Fame? Money? Or is it my position?" Elijah signaled to the event coordinator. On the large screen, a new video began to play. This wasn't just evidence against Reeves. It was footage from a prior incident where he had abused his power, covering up a colleague's misconduct to protect his position. Reeves froze in place. The murmurs turned into boos from the crowd. Some stood up, shouting demands for his immediate resignation. Reeves tried to keep his composure, but sweat began to bead on his forehead. "Enough!" Reeves shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "You don't understand what I've sacrificed to preserve this system. I fought for it while all of you sat back and criticized." Elijah met Reeves's gaze unflinching. "You're right," Elijah replied, his voice cold and cutting. "You fought, but not for justice. You fought to protect your power, and that has hurt not just me, but this entire community." Reeves dropped the microphone, unable to respond further. He lowered his head and walked out of the hall amid the growing chorus of condemnation from the crowd. Once a figure of absolute authority, Reeves now stood as a symbol of corruption and decline. The uproar in the hall swelled, but Elijah, still steady on the stage, responded with calm authority. "Reeves, if you want to talk about personal motives, let me help make them clear to everyone." Elijah signaled again, and a new video began playing on the screen. This one wasn't from Elijah's hidden camera, but from a different incident captured by a resident. In the footage, Reeves was seen participating in the cover-up of another abuse of power, where officers had used excessive force against an innocent individual. The hall erupted. Shouts and questions came from every corner of the room. Reeves stood frozen, his face pale. He didn't say another word, only bowed his head and left the hall in shame. Elijah concluded the meeting with a powerful statement. Change cannot happen if we continue to stay silent. Now is the time to act, to demand justice, and to ensure that what has happened will never happen again. As he stepped off the stage, applause thundered throughout the hall, but Elijah knew that, though this was a victory, the true battle was only just beginning. The public meeting ended, but its echoes continued to ripple through the town. The images, words, and undeniable evidence presented by Elijah became the center of discussions in the media and the community. Pressure mounted from all sides on the police force, especially on Reeves, David, and Chris. Reeves became the primary target of public outrage after the video was shown. Calls for his resignation grew louder, not only from the community but also from members of the town council and some younger officers within the force. In a closed-door meeting, Captain Harris had no choice but to demand Reeves step down. Despite his usual hard-edged demeanor, Reeves could not withstand the mounting pressure. "We have to protect the department's reputation. Harris said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "If you don't resign, things will only get worse for all of us." Reeves looked around the room, his eyes betraying a sense of helplessness. Allies who once stood by him now avoided his gaze. Rising to his feet, he growled, "You think this will save you? Just wait. One day, this system will collapse because of naive fools like you." But Reeves's final words held no weight. He signed his resignation, marking the beginning of the collapse of the old system. A powerful figure in the police department, once a symbol of dominance and abuse of power, was now gone. As Reeves was forced out, David and Chris also faced the consequences of their actions. David, having publicly admitted his wrongdoing during the meeting, became the subject of widespread criticism. However, his acceptance of responsibility earned him some sympathy within the community. A week after the meeting, David held a small press conference. Standing before reporters and a few residents, he spoke with a calm but earnest voice. "I made mistakes. My actions not only hurt one individual, but also betrayed the principles I once swore to uphold. I am resigning and will accept any legal consequences for my actions." David's apology eased some of the community's anger, but his career was over. He left the police department quietly, burdened by the weight of his failures. In contrast, Chris refused to face reality. He declined to resign and continued attempting to justify his behavior by blaming Elijah and even David. In a heated meeting with Harris, Chris shouted, "You can't do this to me. I was just doing what I thought was right. This is all Elijah's fabrication to destroy us." But Chris's words fell on deaf ears. His colleagues, who had once supported him, now kept their distance. Chris was entirely isolated within the department. Not long after, he too was forced to leave, offering no apology, taking no responsibility, and garnering no support. The departure of Reeves, David, and Chris left a significant void in the police department. Officers who had defended them now faced a difficult question. Would they continue to uphold the old system, or would they side with reform? Meanwhile, Elijah saw a glimmer of hope amid the chaos. Though much work remained, the downfall of major figures in the old system demonstrated that change was possible. The departure of Reeves, David, and Chris left a significant void in the police department, but it also created opportunities to rebuild from a fractured foundation. For David and Chris, it was a moment to choose: redemption or continuing down a path of denial. Both chose very different roads. David, despite leaving the police force, couldn't escape the weight of his conscience. His past actions, particularly the fateful night with Elijah, haunted him daily. However, he refused to let himself be consumed by guilt. One morning, David arrived at Elijah's temporary office. Looking weary, he stood hesitantly at the door. Elijah noticed him, his gaze cautious but not unkind. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," David began, his voice low and sincere. "I know what I've done is indefensible, but if there's any way I can help make amends, I'm willing." Elijah studied David for a long moment before replying, "Change isn't easy, David, but if you're truly willing to do the right thing, I have a few ideas." From that day forward, David began participating in community programs organized by Elijah and his team. Initially, his presence was met with suspicion. People who had been victims of abusive power looked at him with guarded eyes. But David didn't back down. He involved himself in every task, from assisting at the community center and supporting struggling families to attending discussions with young people about responsibility and fairness. One day, during a workshop at a high school, a student asked David, "Why should we trust you? You've hurt so many people." David paused, his eyes reflecting remorse, and replied, Don't trust me right now. Judge me by what I do from this moment onward. I can't erase the past, but I can do everything in my power to make sure those mistakes are never repeated." David's answer left the room silent. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild trust, not through words but through consistent actions. In stark contrast, Chris refused to confront his mistakes. After being forced out of the police force, he sank into anger and bitterness. Chris believed he was the victim of a larger conspiracy, convinced that Elijah and his supporters had used him as a scapegoat to push their reform agenda. Chris rejected every opportunity to engage in community programs or make amends. When Elijah, through an intermediary, extended an invitation for Chris to participate in a workshop on accountability and justice, Chris responded with sarcastic disdain. "They want me to sit there and pretend to be sorry? Not a chance." Chris grew increasingly isolated. Former colleagues no longer contacted him. The community turned its back on him, and those who once supported him now kept their distance. One evening, at a small bar, Chris sat alone, bitterness etched across his face. A stranger approached him, recognizing him, and said, "You're Chris, right? The guy Elijah Carter brought down." Chris smirked bitterly and replied, "That's right, but don't think this is over. I'm not letting this all just blow over." But Chris's hostility led him nowhere. No one cared about his excuses anymore. Gradually, he was pushed to the fringes of society, becoming a symbol of downfall and isolation. David and Chris had once been comrades, but now they walked two completely different paths. David chose redemption, though the road was fraught with challenges. He became a positive force within the community, helping to rebuild what he had once harmed. Chris, on the other hand, chose to reject reality, refusing accountability and allowing his anger to consume him. He not only lost his career, but also forfeited any chance to become a better person. Meanwhile, Elijah observed the diverging paths of the two men. He felt neither satisfaction nor triumph over Chris's downfall, nor did he grant David full forgiveness right away. But he understood that true change didn't only come from reform programs. It came from individuals willing to confront their mistakes and rise above them. David, in his efforts to make amends, became a driving force behind community initiatives, emerging as a key figure in reform efforts. His presence symbolized that even those who had strayed could contribute to building a better future. Meanwhile, the once chaotic police department began entering a phase of renewal, thanks to the determination of individuals like Elijah and Morales. Reform initiatives were swiftly implemented, but not without resistance. An independent oversight committee, comprising members from various walks of the community, was established to address complaints against the police. Anti-bias training programs were held regularly, emphasizing the police force's responsibility to serve and protect everyone without discrimination. During one training session, Morales, a dedicated and experienced officer, stood before a group of young recruits. With resolute eyes, she declared, "We're not just enforcers of the law, we're builders of trust. And if you can't understand that, this isn't the place for you." Morales became a role model within the department, not just for her professionalism, but also for how she connected with the community. She led community patrols where officers and residents had the chance to converse and better understand one another. Gradually, the wary gazes of residents softened, replaced by welcoming smiles. Although the community patrols received positive feedback, not everyone was immediately on board with the changes. Initially, some older residents of the town, accustomed to a more authoritative image of the police, expressed skepticism. "I don't think these conversations will change anything," said Mrs. Gladys, owner of a small grocery store, to her neighbors. "The police should be tougher, not trying to make friends with everyone. But over time, as interactions continued, suspicion gave way to empathy. During one patrol, Morales stopped to talk to a young boy playing near his home. The sight of an officer kneeling to his eye level and asking about his school moved Mrs. Gladys. "I've never seen the police like this before," she shared during a community meeting. "Maybe they are trying to change." This transformation didn't happen overnight, but was the result of relentless efforts by Morales and Elijah's team. They understood that rebuilding trust required more than promises. It demanded consistent action. One of the most successful initiatives was a youth outreach program where Morales partnered with schools and community centers to host workshops on safety, responsibility, and the relationship between the police and the public. During one workshop, a student asked Morales, "Aren't you afraid things could go back to how they were?" Morales smiled and replied, "Of course, but that's why we have to work harder every single day. Only through action can we sustain change." Meanwhile, Elijah, though seen by many as a symbol of change, never allowed himself to grow complacent. He understood that one victory didn't mean the fight was over. Elijah continued collaborating with the town council, nonprofit organizations, and the police department to push for deeper reforms. During a meeting with Captain Harris, Elijah posed direct questions. "We've made progress, but what about the deeper systemic issues? Recruitment policies, internal oversight structures, and crisis management for officer mental health. When will we truly address these?" Harris, having faced months of challenges, now found himself aligned with Elijah's vision. He nodded and said, "There's still a lot of work to do, and I won't let it stop here." Elijah didn't limit his presence to official meetings. He spent time attending community gatherings, listening to the stories of individuals, from victims of abuse to young officers hopeful for a better future. Each story, each confession, fueled his resolve. One evening, at an event in the local church, a young boy approached Elijah, his eyes shining brightly. "Mr. Elijah," the boy said shyly, "I want to be a police officer when I grow up, just like you're helping people." Elijah knelt, smiling. "You can be anything you want to be. But if you become a police officer, remember, the most important job isn't to arrest people. It's to protect them." Those words weren't just for the boy, but a reminder to Elijah himself and everyone involved in the reform journey. He knew the road ahead remained long and challenging, but with each step forward, he and the community were moving closer to their goal. The quiet evening descended upon the town, but the lights from street lamps and homes shone brighter than ever. Inside the community center, Elijah stood by the window, gazing at the scene outside. This was a community that had once been mired in discontent and division, but was now finding new unity. Yet, he knew this was only the first step in a long and challenging journey. As Elijah returned to his desk, he noticed a young man standing hesitantly at the doorway. The young man wore a simple shirt, but his eyes radiated determination. "Do you need something?" Elijah asked gently, his voice curious but kind. "Hello, Mr. Elijah," the young man said, his voice trembling slightly. "My name is Jordan. I just wanted to thank you for what you've done, for all of us, and—" Jordan paused, gathering the courage to continue. "I want to become a police officer. I want to help change things like you have." Elijah was silent for a moment, his gaze softening as he saw the sincerity in Jordan's eyes. He had heard similar aspirations before, but there was something about Jordan that gave him a renewed sense of hope. "This job isn't easy, Jordan," Elijah said, his voice both encouraging and cautionary. "It takes a lot of courage, not just to face danger, but to do what's right in a system that's still imperfect." Jordan nodded, his resolve unwavering. I know, but I want to try. I want to be someone the community can trust, and I want to be a good person. Elijah smiled, sensing the earnestness and determination in Jordan. Placing a hand on the young man's shoulder, he said, "If you truly want this, I'll do everything I can to help you achieve your dream. But remember, change doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us working together." After Jordan left, Elijah returned to the window. The pale moonlight illuminated the quiet streets, reminding him of the early days when everything felt like a lonely battle. He thought about the challenges he had faced. The resistance from Reeves, the abuse of power by David and Chris, and the divisions within the community. Yet all of it had led to this moment, a moment of hope. Still, Elijah knew the journey was far from over. Change couldn't be measured by small victories, but by the perseverance to sustain the reforms that had been achieved. He understood that more challenges lay ahead. More figures like Reeves might emerge, but there would also be more people like Jordan. Looking ahead, Elijah realized the importance wasn't in perfecting the system immediately, but in maintaining the determination to move step by step toward a better future. Every meeting, every workshop, every relationship built. These were the building blocks of a strong foundation for the community. As the glow from the streetlights reflected on Elijah's face, he thought to himself, "We're not finished, but we've begun." And sometimes, a beginning is all it takes to change a generation. In the town's peaceful air, laughter and chatter echoed faintly in the distance, carrying a sense of belief that, though the path remained challenging, the future was brightening with the community's hope and determination. The open-ended nature of this story doesn't just suggest continuity. It emphasizes that the journey of reform is always a collective effort, one without a definitive endpoint. Elijah, Jordan, and the entire community represent real change, slow but steady. Elijah Carter's story is not just a fight for justice, but a testament to the power of perseverance and determination in transforming an imperfect system. Though the road ahead remains fraught with obstacles, each step of progress has sown seeds of hope for a fairer future for everyone. What do you think of the choices made by the characters in this story? If you were in Elijah's position, what would you do to continue driving change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this story with someone who would appreciate it, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for watching.